chairs, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Maybe. I don't see Kevin. I think he's coming. I could do something to entertain you, but I'm not sure what that would be. No, you don't want, that would not be entertainment. I don't have a book on me. Here's
Give me a break. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you don't know one of them.
I know a 5-liner. Yeah, it's true. She is. Would you like to come? You haven't been in front of a mic for a while. Kathleen, you want to come up? Chat? No? No? You know what my granddaughter told me when she was pretty little, right around kindergarten age, and I had said something like, I wanted this, and she says, you get what you get and you don't throw a fit. Yeah. Yeah, she learned it in kindergarten. All right, I believe we're ready to roll here. All right, the next 3 readers, we're gonna just go 1, 1, 1. So not a big break in between any of those, and then we'll have a short break while we get the chairs and stuff ready for the forum. So here we go. Kevin Clouther is the author of the story collections Maximum Speed by Cornerstone, and We Are Flying to Chicago, Catapult. His stories have appeared in Confrontation, Gettysburg Review, Gulf Coast, Joyland, and Ruminate, among other journals. He holds degrees from the University of Virginia and Iowa Writers Workshop and is a recipient of the Richard Yates Fiction Award and Joe Residency Award. He is an associate professor at the University of Nebraska, Omaha Writers Workshop, where he directs the MFA program in writing. He lives with his wife and 2 children in Omaha, and we are lucky to have him here. Please help me welcome Kevin.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Bonnie, for inviting me, and thank you, Chad, for organizing this event with Bonnie. This is my first time at Northeast Community College and my first time in Norfolk. I just checked that pronunciation, so if it's wrong, you can blame Bonnie. I'm going to read a story from Maximum Speed, which is my second story collection that came out in the fall. The story's titled A1A. Billy knew he had to do it all before time ran out. How much time he had was an interesting question. The answer was not a lot. The answer was to get moving already. His whole life he'd been moving, from nice neighborhood to less nice, from one pose to the next. He liked moving. People liked watching him move. Although he couldn't see everything, he could see that. The pleasure others took in watching him. He took no such pleasure in watching anyone else. Things that brought Billy pleasure: salt water in his hair, his mother's laughter in the next room, pickles and cheeseburgers. The ocean was best. There he was small, just the size he wanted to be. Who in the ocean feels otherwise? The key was patience, waiting for the tug and then swimming furiously, so his body crested just as the wave did. To be carried, to give himself over completely to an invisible force. When he timed it right, there was no better feeling. And then when it was over, to swim back and wait for the tug again. On the best days, that was all he did. But there were no waves today. He bobbed in the ocean, willing them to form, but none of his spells worked. On shore, the sand was covered with empty towels. He lay on the first one he reached. The sun got to work right away. He closed his eyes. He could almost forget sometimes. When he opened them, The shape was fighting its way into focus. He pushed himself up and squinted, though that didn't help. He squinted for other people to show he was trying. "That's my towel," the shape said. It didn't feel right, Billy confessed. How long had he slept? It seemed only a moment, yet the towels had all been tucked into bags or slung over shoulders. The sand returned to its primal state. He retrieved his shirt and sandals from beneath the bottom step of the pavilion, where he always left them, and gave him faith to return to them unstolen. He never brought a towel of his own. The world had a way of accommodating this need. Billy smelled the exhaust of the patrol car before it announced itself at the top of the steps. The car was piloted by his mother's boyfriend, whose loud and insistent belief in justice, civic and personal, was less notable than his perpetually red face. Officer Peters asked Billy if he wanted to go for a ride. "I didn't steal the towel," Billy said. "What towel?" the officer asked, securing the handcuffs. They drove slowly in the way only cops do. Billy stared at the usual things from the back of the car. "I want to show you something," Officer Peters said. This wasn't Billy's first ride in the back. Officer Peters had a way, since he started dating Billy's mother, of finding Billy. Although he'd never admit it, this impressed him. Billy respected cleverness. He liked that Officer Peters never told Billy how he knew where he was, though the more Billy thought about this, the easier it seemed. It wasn't like he was running a drug ring. The car always had a destination, the more horrifying, the better. Sometimes they toured blasted-out neighborhoods, the likes of which Billy had no idea existed, which was the point. Every house had a chain-link fence, waist-high. Every house had a barking dog inside the fence. Every house had a car missing something, a wheel, a window, on the other side of the fence. "You don't know how lucky you are," Officer Peters liked to say when they passed a particularly incomplete car. "I know exactly how lucky I am," Billy said each time. Other times they drove past people living beneath overpasses and their tattered possessions. He didn't think a car could go so slow. Some people had signs constructed from cardboard boxes in magic marker. The signs pointed to their status as veterans or parents. "Anything helps," the signs all read. Officer Peters read them knowingly. His tone was clear. Nothing helps. Another thing he liked to do was offer examples. Did Billy know? He never knew, that was also the point. That most violent crimes occur between 5 and 8 in the evening, Officer Peters emphasized, as though there were something suspiciously feminine about the word, and they were in on a private joke. Billy didn't think from the back seat of the patrol car that he was in on anything. He wondered if they were about to see a violent crime. It wasn't even 2 o'clock. Their first stop, there was usually more than one, was a parking lot. Billy didn't see any other cars. He thought, drug deal. Then he thought, where's the dealer? Who's the dealt? What do you notice? Officer Peters wanted to know. Nobody's here. It occurred to Billy, not for the first time, that Officer Peters could do something very bad. There wasn't anybody to prevent him from doing so. He turned off the ignition while Billy considered this. The thing about your mother, Officer Peters said, is she has a lot on her plate. That's one thing. At this point, he opened the door. Billy examined his locked door mournfully. He watched Officer Peters survey the empty parking lot from outside the car. "I want to help your mother," he said, "which is a way of helping you. You can start letting me out." He peered at Billy through the open door. Officer Peters reached into his pocket. Billy feared mace, but Officer Peters produced a book of matches. One by one, he began to light them. "She loves me," he dropped a match. "She loves me not." Billy distrusted showiness. It seemed a distraction from imminent menace. "What am I being charged with?" he asked. "Don't get cute." Officer Peters closed his door and reappeared at Billy's, where he knocked on the window as though the door weren't locked, and Billy's wrists weren't dented from cuffs. Officer Peters swung the door wide. He said, "Some things you have to see for yourself." Billy blinked into the Florida sun, relentlessly bright, even in its slow descent. How did anyone get away with anything in this light? Officer Peters produced his gun, aimed it at the horizon. In profile, arms outstretched and fingers wrapped around the weapon, he resembled somebody's idea of courage. "You're blind, right?" he asked. "Legally." "What kind of law is that?" "I can see, just not." He discharged 1, 2, 3, 4 rounds into the light. It was true that Billy couldn't follow them to their resting place. "Somebody will hear you," Billy said. "Your hearing is sensitive on account of the blindness." Sensitive was a word Billy could do without. He'd heard that one enough. "Anyhow, that's not what I want to show you," Officer Peters said. He undid the cuffs. They walked for a while before a building rose from the asphalt. Rose was overstating it. The building was squat, like you could jump onto the roof with a running head start. Billy considered doing this now that he could move his arms again. "The inhabitants," Officer Peters said, "are salt of the earth types." "I don't know what that means." "It means they have nothing. People feel bad." Officer Peters didn't wait for a reply to his knocking. Billy couldn't believe how dark it was inside. It was as though someone had sucked all the light out of the room with a vacuum. Or maybe it was a vacuum they entered. "I asked you to leave," Officer Peters lit another match. "Here you are." "You," Billy learned, was a big number. Maybe 25, maybe double that. "Some are legal," Officer Peters said. "Some aren't. You can't just ask." When he reached for his belt, everyone flinched, but he only produced a flashlight. He kept the light out of people's eyes, choosing to run the beam over each of the walls, highlighting what wasn't there. Light switches weren't there, or windows. Then he turned his beam to the floor, which wasn't exactly dirt. The small dog mistook this for a game and leapt at the light. "Well, there," a woman whispered urgently. "Revolver?" Officer Peters asked. "To return," Billy said. The dog looked up at Officer Peters. He reached out his hand, which the dog first sniffed and then licked. For a long time, this was the only sound in the room. "Leave," Officer Peters said. "For your own good, salir." "Adonde?" the man asked. "Donde no es mi problema." When Officer Peters clicked off the light, the dog barked a solitary bark. He left through the door he'd entered. Billy followed. "Why?" he asked. "Not everyone feels the way I do." "How do you feel?" Officer Peters stopped. "I'm not trying to, your father." The walk back to the car was quiet. Maybe the job numbed you, or maybe growing up numbed you, or maybe he wasn't numb. Maybe on the inside he was screaming. Billy looked for evidence of this. He listened. "I guess I should bring you home," Officer Peters said. "We're back to the beach. What do you think?" "Can I sit in front?" "Your mother thinks you're smart." "Your mother told me you're smart, or think you are." "She thinks I am." "You can never sit in front." At least this time Billy could sit without handcuffs. Beach, he decided. Too late. But they weren't taking any route home that Billy recognized. "This isn't the way we go," he said. "I thought you couldn't see," and listened to the road. Officer Peters increased his speed. "One more stop," he said. They were far from A1A now, approaching 95. You could take it all the way to Miami or Maine. Billy had never been to either. He wondered about Officer Peters' jurisdiction. "My mother's expecting me," Billy said. "She's expecting me too." It was amazing how even with the lights off and the sirens silent, cars got out of their way. "Where are we going?" Billy asked. "I got a call." I didn't hear any call. That was another thing Billy wondered about. Aren't cops supposed to travel in twos? Movies were unanimous on this point. "Why don't you have a partner?" he asked. "She's on stakeout." Staking out what? They were going very fast now. Billy tried to read the billboards. He got the general idea. Buying things makes beautiful people happy. Billy distrusted beautiful people. "What will happen to the people we saw?" he asked. "If they're smart, they'll leave." Billy wasn't sure. If they had somewhere else to go, why would they be underground in the first place? When he got home, he'd go back. He didn't know what he'd do, but he'd do something. He divided the world between people who tried and people who'd given up, or never started. Mostly, he encountered these people, though he still believed in the possibility of being someone else. At least, sometimes he did. Other times he thought it was all bullshit. Officer Peters drove to a different city. Billy had never been there, though they didn't travel far. The city was principally known for its prison, which backed into an endless expanse of swamp, more or less unchanged from the beginning of time. "I know about this place," Billy said. "You don't know anything." It didn't look like his idea of prison. For one thing, the wall was so tall he could scarcely see anything. The color of the wall surprised him. It looked as though it were made of sand. He wanted to touch it, if only to confirm he couldn't push his fingers through to the other side. He suspected Officer Peters wanted Billy to ask about the other side, but he was unwilling to do so. "My mother really is expecting me," he said. "My job is to keep them out of here. So, keep them out." Officer Peters nodded, as if in response to a higher calling. "Although, they don't go here first," he said. "They don't even go to the same place. It's complicated." A patrol car approached from the opposite direction. When the car stopped, the driver's side window lowered. "This part is like the movies," Officer Peters admitted. "Who do you have back there?" the other officer asked. "Juvenile delinquent." "Bad news about the thing I was going to do for you." Officer Peters fiddled with some buttons on the dashboard. "Can you at least take him back to his mother's?" Officer Peters looked back to Billy. There was something apologetic in the look, even gentle. It made him uncomfortable. He thought it made Officer Peters uncomfortable too. He held his gaze. Maybe he recognized something of Billy's mother, or maybe he felt bad sentencing Billy to a fate he didn't understand. Whatever the look was, his opinion wasn't solicited. Officer Martinez let Billy sit in front. "So you know how to get there?" he said. "Get where?" Officer Martinez asked. He took little interest in other cars. He treated traffic lights as poorly thought out suggestions. His car, more than Officer Peters, purred with authority. Or was it arrogance? Billy may have been pursuing distinctions that don't exist. He couldn't believe how fast they were going when they started going faster. "How long have you known Officer Peters?" Officer Martinez asked. "I don't really know him." "That's not what he says." Billy was curious but unwilling to reveal this. His unwillingness was a fierce point of pride. "You probably think the job is a lot of car chases and gunfights," Officer Martinez said. "I don't think that." Billy saw something different in Officer Martinez's driving, even as Officer Martinez maintained an extraordinary speed. It was as though he suddenly remembered where he was going or what he was leaving. It was as though he'd been avoiding something, which roared into his mind and set up camp, and there was nothing to do but deal with this thing. Billy said, "Do you know about the house with like a lot of houses like that?" Outside, the world began to resemble something. He counted the drugstores and nail places and bagel shops. The only thing different in each strip mall was the coloring on the signs. Even the cars and the parking lots were the same. "Can we go to the house?" Billy asked. "To do what?" "Help." "So, a cop and a kid. Shouldn't you be in school?" "Technically." cop and kid knock and say what? You're free not to get caught, take this opportunity to seek opportunities so long as you seek it in the right places. It's not so much what we say. What so much is it? One step at a time, Billy thought. Sure, Officer Martinez decided. We can go. But he meant what he said. There were a lot of houses like that. They could drive all day without knocking on the right door, which is precisely what they did. It was always the same. Nobody opened the door. Officer Martinez acted unsurprised, even uninterested. Billy was unaccustomed to adults taking him seriously and observed Officer Martinez for signs of mockery. Billy found none. The doors began to blend together. What separates one door from another? Beyond the eyes on the other side. Officer Martinez expressed no curiosity. He didn't announce himself or look through windows. Is this part of your normal routine? Billy asked. There's no normal. Officer Martinez knocked twice before turning to the car. There's no routine. Each door, Billy wondered if it would be the last. He was getting tired, or maybe disillusioned. He asked Officer Martinez if that was the point. There's no point. Billy began to study the doors for clues. He began to study Officer Martinez. Perhaps there was something Billy had missed, something that would shed light on, no, he was being stupid. It wasn't like that. He knew better. Still, he couldn't help himself. Didn't this door look a little heavier, a little darker? That about does it, Officer Martinez eventually said. Does what? You're not authorized to receive that answer. So there really is no point? He stared at the patrol car and then at Billy. Officer Martinez said, "You're going to have to tell me where you live." Billy told him. "You're going to have to tell me a few more things." But it wasn't true. Officer Martinez never asked, and Billy never volunteered. Even if he weren't frightened, Billy didn't know what to say. They drove at a normal speed. He didn't look at anything. He didn't listen to anything. Patiently, he waited to get home, where his life would resume as though nothing had happened. Nothing had happened. His mother, as promised, was expecting him. She stood tall, burning, glorious. Billy wanted to say or do something to let her know her light filled the doorway, but when he opened his mouth, he felt his face contorting into a shape anguished and irrevocable. He hoped there was ancient wisdom to this shame. She said, "Someday you'll leave me." He said, "It's not like, I know what it's like." But she didn't know. How could she? This wasn't his life. This was something else, borrowed maybe, or left on the doorstep. Tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that, he'd start his life. Billy knew it wouldn't last long, so he'd have to be ready. He'd have to make his life count, once it was his. Thank you.
All right, that was fabulous. Thank you very much, Kevin. And now, Karen, is it Gethard? Gettert. Karen Gettert Shoemaker. Writes fiction, nonfiction, poetry, book reviews, journal entries, and endless lists. Her recent work includes a reflection on the role of ordinary people during a pandemic, which was published in the New York Times in 2020. The Meaning of Names, her novel, The Meaning of Names, was selected for the One Book, One Nebraska statewide reading program in 2016, which I believe is the last time I had you here. I think it was. And the Omaha Reads Community Reading Program in 2014. It was republished in China in 2020. Her short story collection, Night Sounds and Other Stories, was published in the U.S. in 2002 and republished in the United Kingdom in 2006. She is a founder of Lark Song Writers Place, a literary nonprofit based in Lincoln. Please help me welcome Karen.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Thanks for inviting me. The readings this morning, coming after Kevin, this is amazing. The key phrase in that introduction was her recent work was in 2020. That tells you a little bit about how things have been going with my writing life. You know, there's this kind of, not tradition, this thing that happens with women's lives, that they do their career and then they have children, and no matter what, it seems, there's this stoppage for a while. That's traditionally what happens. And then you get back to the career world. Well, for me, that has kind of happened because in 2020, I opened Lark's on Writer's Place. And that's like the kid that stopped my writing career. So I am picking up my writing career. And today what I'm going to read is, sadly, possibly something I read in 2016 when you last had me here. I have a novel called The Last Living Waitress of the Home Cafe that I've been working on forever, I do believe. But it did get finished, and I sent it out. An agent took it around to a lot of places. People loved it, but did not love it enough. And finally, I decided after a year and a half of it being schlepped around that I was going to take it back and rip it apart, which I did last year. And I ripped this novel completely apart and taken a novel that had a 16-year time span and turned it into something that happens in 3.5 months. So what I'm going to read you the first 2 chapters of it, so you don't have to really know anything else about it, other than I just want to say that basically what I'm reading is, what I have to offer you today is the kind of vulnerability of a writer who is willing to humble themselves in front of a piece of work that insists on doing what it wants, no matter what. So I hope you enjoy this. The Last Living Waitress of the Home Cafe. You'll meet the 2 major characters. The first character is Marie. This takes place in 1973. What surprised me most about my death was the absolute abruptness of it. There was no premonition, no tingle of anticipation or dread, no looking up and seeing it coming and sucking in that one last lungful of mortal air. No pain even, just death, sudden and true. We were driving into town and I was trying to explain something to Mark that I had learned about fire, how it spreads. The 2 of us had been fighting for days, and I was so tired of the marital back and forth that went nowhere that I had jumped at the chance to get into that pickup and go anywhere. Windshield time can be its own kind of therapy. But once we got on the road, I found myself incapable of bringing up any subject we needed to discuss, and instead found myself deep into one of my long stories, the kind that Mark found so charming when we first met, that lately simply tightened a muscle in his jaw. It doesn't always need open flames to spread, I was saying to him, my head down so I didn't have to look at that muscle. There are 3 elements necessary for a fire to spread, and flame itself isn't even one of them. 1, obviously, it needs something that can burn, that's flammable. 2, it needs really high heat, as in above the point of ignition. And finally, it needs oxygen. Then, boom, the invisible pressure of this thing firefighters call a fire triangle just explodes. The firefighters say that when it's in the tops of trees, it can sound like a train coming too fast around a curve, a screeching sound that hurts your ears. So loud you can't hear a person right beside you shouting in your ear. After days of talking to one another, I admit I had built up a head of steam, and I felt so released by the images I was creating in my mind, I didn't notice him to start to break. Had I looked up, my last words might not have been about the dangers of converging spot fires. Instead, my hands were cupped, my head down, my breathing slow, as I concentrated on the image of the fire following itself. Beside me, Mark cursed at the same moment something big came through the windshield. Mark had been driving fast, had the blinker on to pass a truck that was also speeding, when lumber of some sort that hadn't been secured correctly flew off the back of the truck in front of us, just as Mark crossed the center line. I didn't see what kind of truck it was, though Mark did. He always noted things like that. He would have known who was driving that truck. The first piece smashed into the cab at eye level. my eye level. The second larger piece landed on top of our pickup and caved in the passenger side where I sat pinned by the first. The pickup spun and rolled a significant distance, but by then it was superfluous to me. I was lost in a sentence of my own making, and then I wasn't. In the beginning there was the word, they say, but in the end, there were only my words. Isn't that curious? Not everyone fares as well as I in the moment of death, that death comes. Mark, for example, I won't go into the gruesome details, but he did take a long time to let go of the tether that held him to this solid earth, the vessel of him so mangled in the crash. Still, in the end, I think death surprised him as much as it did me. Though in my case, I didn't see it coming at all, and in his case, he saw it coming and refused to accept it, ignored it, in fact, and kept riding away from it for what must have felt like years to him, just to avoid seeing what was there waiting for him. Death, open arm, right outside the broken window. Mark's determined efforts to hold on to the last seconds of his life didn't matter. Death insisted on its due, with or without his full attention, as it does for all of us eventually. As for me, as I said, I was looking down at my living hands, talking about fire, and then I was here. Where that is, I can't explain other than to say it is a feeling of being everywhere and nowhere, of knowing everything and nothing at all. I don't have anything more to say about Mark. He left me behind, and he left our daughter behind too. He simply disappeared into the afterlife without a backwards glance, much the way he would sometimes leave for work on the morning of one of our arguments, closing the door without kissing me goodbye. I didn't have that whole life flash before my eyes sort of thing one hears about. So why does this particular memory linger? It's one of my mother. Given the option, I would have chosen another, though any memory I chose would have included Maggie. All memories, all roads of me lead to Maggie. It was of the day I told my mother about Maggie, though of course I didn't know she was Maggie then. I just knew she was a baby growing in me. I can see my mother standing by the kitchen sink with her back to me. I stood by the door that led to the living room when I told her. I began with saying, "I'm sorry," and ended with the same. She kept her back to me for a long spell after I blurted out the news. When she finally turned around, her left eyebrow was raised and her lips pressed into a tight, thin smile. I knew it to be the familiar face of her deepest anger. She kept her gaze focused on me until I said, "I'm sorry," again. When she finally spoke, her lips barely moved. "Are you sorry alone? It takes two to make this particular mistake." Not what I had expected, to be offered an out this way. But she had a way of giving that felt like taking, so I simply stared at the headlights of her anger and waited. "That's still true, isn't it, Marie? That's how it works, right?" Her smile tightened into tiny upward curls at the corners of her mouth, and her eyebrows leveled out. She crossed her arms. "Marie, I trust you know enough about the birds and the bees to know how this happened. We discussed this. I sat you down on the sofa right there.